Hi, my name is Regina Feeney, librarian and archivist of the Freeport Memorial Library and trustee of the Freeport Historical Society and Museum.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Nastro, archivist and special collections librarian at the Port Washington Public Library.
Today, Vanessa and I are presenting our first installment of Port to Port. This lecture series will discuss interesting topics using materials found in our individual collections and present history from a North Shore, South Shore perspective.
We decided to begin this series with the history of lantern slides, a really interesting and unique photographic medium, not widely known, but found in the collections of PWPL and FML.
Full disclosure, Vanessa used to work at FML and assisted me in our archives. Our first collection she and I worked on together was organizing, scanning, and rehousing Freeport's 600 plus lantern slides.
That's 600 slides to our mere 80 slides, but still impressive in my opinion. After leaving Freeport, I worked for a few years with an auction house in New York, where I also had the pleasure of working with lantern slide collections. These specifically belong to the photographer Alfred Stieglitz. And then I left the auction world and became the archivist at PWPL. So our collection of lantern slides is not as varied as Freeport's collection, but we do have many great images of Port Washington. These lantern slides are part of a larger collection of images taken by Henry K. Landis and John J. Whitmer Sr. I can talk a little bit more about these two people later in the presentation.
All right, so let's begin. What are magic lantern slides? Well, they are transparent drawings or photographic images that are projected onto a flat screen using a device known as a magic lantern. Slides are positive transparencies that are sandwiched between two thin pieces of glass. The glass with the photographic image is known as the image glass, and that is protected by a covering known as the cover glass. The images are either hand-drawn or are a photograph, and they're usually black or white or hand-tinted, and often include a paper mask or mat framed that frame the images. Often the mask included the name of the manufacturer. Once assembled, the slides were secured on all four sides with tape. In this slide, the top image is called the image glass because the photograph is printed directly on the glass. Laid directly on top of that image glass is the paper mask. This mask includes the name of the manufacturer, T.H. McAllister, whose business was located at 49 Nassau Street in Manhattan. The bottom slide is the glass cover, which is placed on top of the mask. And then there's tape holding those two pieces of glass together. On this particular lantern slide, there is a slide title that identifies the image. Oftentimes, there is also a number on the slide. So it would tell the projectionist what the order those slides were put in for viewing.
So why magic? Why do we call them magic lanterns? Magic lantern slides. So the word magic is often used in association with lantern slides and lantern projectors. It originates from the perception that these devices were connected with the supernatural. In the 1500s, Italian scientist Giambattista della Porta was charged with sorcery by Pope Paul V after experimenting with optics and light. Della Porta's research in optics were actually visionary, and he also played an important role in the development of the camera obscura. He was also ordered by the church to close the Accademia dei Segreti, the Academy of Mysteries of Nature, which he founded in 1560. This was the first scientific society. I believe it closed around 1578. Even when the myth of the magic lantern as a conjuring device was debunked in the late 1600s, the device soon became a popular entertainment tool for stage magicians. In the latter half of the 19th century, magic lantern slides became an important educational tool for universities, camera clubs, and religious organizations. And this gentleman right here is Giambattista della Porta. And to the right, you see one of his books, Natural Magic, which he wrote in the 1550s, I believe, late 1550s. Next slide. Between 1794 and 1800, Belgian magician Etienne Gaspard Robertson staged magic lantern slide shows known as Phantasmagoria in an abandoned monastery in Paris. Hidden from the audience, sitting in complete darkness, the lantern could be moved towards and away from the screen to create this illusion of advancing or fast receding aerial phantoms. Next slide. So these phantasmagoria displays were true multimedia events. They depicted frightening subjects such as ghosts, phantoms, devils, skeletons, skulls, grave diggers, witches, and monks. Robertson used thunder and lightning effects, ventriloquism, spine-tingling glass harmonica music, electric shocks, shadow show effects, life-size masked figures, incense and smoke, the psychological processes of sensory deprivation, and physical disorientation. Some historians even referred to them as suicide scary theaters. In fact, it actually did drive one person to commit suicide, a German coffee shop owner, during one of these stagings. The full effect was so terrifying, it induced fainting spells in women, much to the delight of their gentlemen courtiers, who could then hold them close as they fell into their arms. I mean, we know now that the spectacle was pure illusion, but imagine seeing this as an 18th century citizen. Remember, this was pre-cinema. Moving images were in its infancy here. But as performances continued and became more popular, there was more emphasis on the performance and less on the supernatural activity. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the differences between lantern slides and glass plate negatives, because it's very easy to confuse the two. But they have distinct differences. A lantern slide, first and foremost, is a positive transparency, not a negative. It can only project a positive image and will not create a positive print. Also, by the late 19th century, lantern slides had uniform dimensions, whereas glass plate negatives varied in size. Lantern slides were also found in sets covering a specific theme or subject. The individual slides also contain some sort of identification written or printed along its edge, which can be very helpful when trying to identify the image, looking at people, places, dates, etc. So the images you see here on the screen, to the left is an example of a lantern slide from our collection from PWPL, and on the right is an example of a glass plate negative from Freeport's collection. So our image on the left, it's a lantern slide from around 1903. It's and it was titled on the actual slide, Execution Rock Lighthouse. So I put this slide here because it's one of my favorites in the collection. And there's also a great story that goes along with it. So Execution Rock, so referencing the sort of menacing and jagged rocks that were lurking below the water surface in Long Island Sound. So it's midway between Sands Point and New Rochelle. The rocks were only visible at low tide, and it was the cause of many shipwrecks. So many, in fact, that a lighthouse was commissioned to be built on the small solitary outcropping you see in the image in 1847. So rumor has it that in colonial times, local prisoners were waiting to be executed would be chained to these rocks at low tide. And as the water began to rise, the prisoners would slowly drown, hence the name Execution Rock. As per the old chip in the background, one of the handwritten notations on the reverse of this slide simply says British ship lost on Execution Rock. What about your image, Regina?
Well, this is a glass plate. It was taken between 1892 and 1893. This is the only school in Freeport on Pine Street. An interesting thing about this particular picture, this is like a first grade or a kindergarten class. This school burns down in January of 1893. So this is probably the last photograph ever taken of that building. And I often joke that it probably had something to do with the fact that there was glass lighting and a very dry Christmas tree in the picture. Often glass negatives were stored stacked, one negative on top of the other. I saw this a lot in my work at the Freeport Historical Society. Unfortunately, what happens is that the weight of those negatives would cause the negative on the bottom to crack or shatter. And so the biggest difference between lantern slides and glass plate negatives is that lantern slides were made to be transportable. Lantern slide exhibitors took great care to protect their slides from damage. Most used specially designed boxes or cases. Slide cases made mostly of wood had hinged lids and vertical groove partitions separating each slide for storage and transit. Slotted cases also provide ventilation that allowed the slide to cool between performances. Some fancier boxes had felt to absorb shock when the box was sent through the mail. Because of the great care taken to protect these images from breaking, lantern slides may represent the only photographic image or event or location that has survived to modernity. And Vanessa, I think these are from your collection?
So these are from our collection. So if you see the image on the right, which looks very similar to what was on the previous slide, what Regina was talking about, this is how we received the collection of many of our lantern slides. And we received the bulk of the collection in 2013. So just looking at this box for an archivist, it's, kind of, heart-shattering because wood is not good for storage. So the lantern slides were kind of forgotten, and we had recently stumbled across these. This was the original wooden box that they came in. So the first thing that we did was we took account of all the slides. I think it ended up being around 80 or so, and we removed them. We made sure, nothing was broken. We very, very gently kind of brushed off any sort of dust or debris that had accumulated over the slides over, the many years that it was mishoused. And we used something called a 4-flap enclosure. And that's something you can see on the bottom image, this little white kind of like folding envelope that gently yet securely kind of cradles the image. And then we use that, we rehouse them, and then we scan them. And you could see I'm wearing gloves. I always wear gloves when I scan lantern slides or glass plate negatives for that matter, because they are so fragile, and you're putting them also on a glass scanner. So you just want to be very, very gentle with them. And then once we have them scanned, cataloged, inventoried, all the metadata is there. You can see along the left edge some of the information that we pulled off of the lantern slide that was originally written on there. And then they were rehoused in these acid-free barrier board storage boxes, which you can see on the top. And because they didn't fit in the whole box, you kind of don't want that box jingling around. So we just have a little spacer in the back to kind of keep everything tight, not too tight, but nice and tidy in the box. Yeah. So that was a fun project.
Yeah. I think you might recall at Freeport, we only had 1 or 2 in wooden boxes. And Vanessa's right. That wood after a while really leads to the drying out of the tape. So you have to be really careful because you don't want to pull them out and have them separate. And definitely we always wear gloves. You don't want your fingerprints on them. But I've made the mistake of doing some glass negatives and cut myself on them because they can be incredibly sharp. So we keep.
I think I cut myself. Mm-hmm. I cut myself scanning them at Freeport. But you know what? You learn from that. So
you learn, exactly. And the boxes are artifacts. So we also keep
Mhm.
boxes because they're just sort of interesting, and in sort of presentation like this, we're like, okay, look, this is what they were stored in. And yes, they helped them keep them safe for 130 years, but now we're going to migrate them to a storage system that will make sure they last another 130 years. Okay, so
Right, and we did keep that box.
yes, oh, definitely, definitely. Okay, so lantern slides that were produced after 1890 included a paper mask. Masks are also referred to as mats or mounts. These paper frames were usually created from black or white opaque paper and surrounded an image that was usually no more than 2 3/4 by 2 3/4 inches in size. Um, though cut to fit the slide's dimension, masks had different sizes and shape apertures. Masks were used because for several reasons. First, they gave the image a pleasing border that was used to crop out unnecessary details from the photograph. So sort of an early version of Photoshop. Second, the tiny gap created by the mask kept the image from adhering to the cover glass. Without the mask, the image could be easily damaged if the glass cover needed to be separated from the image glass. Sometimes when that tape starts to wear and they start to move around, that image can actually start to be taken off, scraped off by the top of the image glass. So this kind of provides a little bit of a cushion. Finally, the masks often had printed information that identified the manufacturer, the slide title, and the slide's position in a set of slides. The standard slide became the prevailing type when the International Congress of Photography met in Paris in 1889 and set standards for lantern slide dimensions. Now, I don't know why various regions had different sizes, but I suspect it might have to do with making sure that no country or region could flood the market with inexpensive slides. It also gives local manufacturers more control in their markets. The way DVDs today are regionally coded so that they can only be played in the regions that they're purchased. Now, I haven't been able to prove it, so this is just my theory. But keep in mind, if somebody were to have gone to Europe, their projectors in the United States would not be able to accommodate those slides. So they would need to either alter their projector, or they would have to buy a whole new one.
Amateur photographers and camera clubs helped create a strong market for lantern slides as a lecturing tool. There were fewer than 10 camera clubs in America in 1880. Almost all of their members were commercial photographers, scientists, chemists, and opticians. By the 1890s, there were over 150 clubs with mostly amateur members. And as lantern slide production became more popular with amateurs, camera clubs would host monthly or bi-monthly lantern slide presentations of members' photographs. These lantern slides enabled camera club members to collectively view a photograph simultaneously. One of the largest clubs, the Camera Club of New York, which we see here on the screen, had designed its clubhouse to include facilities to show lantern slide projections. By 1894, 21 separate clubs across the United States and England shared slides through the American Slide Interchange. Each club would pick the best 100 slides created by their members and circulate the collections amongst the various clubs. Occasionally, members from the presenting club would travel with the collection and introduce the individual slides. I mean, we're doing that right now, aren't we? We're collectively viewing a presentation, a collection of images. So we're not just talking about, the task of printing out the individual photographs, mounting them, framing them, exhibiting them, and then, each person, go to each individual image. I mean, we still do that today, but lantern slides had become so popular, and this was a way of just utilizing this, this new method of viewing images, really.
Right. I mean, you think about it, like you go to a museum today or a gallery, everybody is looking at different images at different times. So this allowed people to, like right now, what we're doing, everyone is focusing on the same image and we're talking about it. So that was sort of the beauty of these lantern slides. Um, there was a variation in the magic lanterns, which were used to project the slides. And you can, this probably had something to do with the fact that manufacturers were attempting to outdo their competition. Some had single lenses, others included multiple lenses. And multiple lenses allowed the projectionist to bypass the loading times of slides. So it allowed slides to be put into a queue. And so you could just, go through them in sequence rather than having to wait for the projectionist to pull out a slide and put a new one in. It also allowed the slides to cool down because they would get very hot. Wooden lanterns were almost always made of mahogany, and metal lanterns were mainly made of a steel plate, which is often incorrectly referred to as tin. The lanterns had many parts. Most importantly, they included the lamp house, the chimney or vent, the illuminant, and the lens. Before electricity, the illuminant was a flame created by oil or gas. In some cases, lanterns used limelight, which was produced by heating a piece of calcium oxide, using a flame created through the combination of oxygen and hydrogen gas. Now, if this seems unsafe, it was, and there are many stories of exploding lanterns. Remember, you got oxygen and hydrogen and an open flame. Not to mention it, you might have a projectionist who was a smoker. So what could go wrong? And if you think of terms of oxygen and hydrogen and some spark, you're thinking of the Hindenburg. And there are stories of these things blowing up during a performance. So you did risk your life going to some of these shows. Keep in mind, electric lanterns, which were later produced once electricity came about. So we moved away from an open flame to these electric lanterns. They stopped being manufactured in the 1940s. That means you're talking about having lanterns that are over 70 years old. And me personally, I'm not plugging that in. So, and it isn't just my fear of being electrocuted by 70-year-old wiring. In Freeport, we came across slides that are close to 130 years old. Over the decades, the tape that holds that glass together has really dried out. And electric lanterns, like modern projectors, produce a lot of heat. And my fear is that both are either the tape that holds the lantern slides together, or the labels that are affixed to these lantern slides could start a fire. So this is why our collection has been scanned and can be viewed online as JPEGs or in presentations like this using PowerPoint. Okay, so these are some of the reoccurring themes of lantern slides. The highlighted themes can be found in the collection of the Freeport Memorial Library. So we have geography, history, temperance, song slides, and religion. And I think you, Vanessa, I think you have a lot of local history and travel logs at Port Washington.
Yeah, we have some travel logs, but the majority of our lantern slide collection focuses on just capturing community events, local businesses, and local landscapes of Port Washington.
Okay. And there was a big push to promote history and teaching in schools and universities beginning in 1885. And lantern slides became the method through which geographical knowledge was disseminated throughout communities. Geography slides included visits to foreign lands as well as familiar locales. These slides included images of world fairs and expositions. This slide includes, in this particular slide that you're seeing on the screen, includes colorized photographs of the Middle East and a pier in New York City. And I have to admit, and I think you recall this, Vanessa, that some of our slides at Freeport really bordered on sensationalism. A couple of the foreign travel slides included images of people suffering from advanced stages of leprosy. So some of them are not very pleasant to look at. But all in all, it really, imagine, living in the 1890s, and, just travel is so difficult. Suddenly you can visit the world, if, without actually leaving your hometown. Um, Here are some examples of some history slides from the Freeport's collection. And history slides were used mainly in teaching. And these included war depictions of ancient Rome and Greece, European royalty, and American presidents. Freeport has a large collection of Spanish-American war slides. And this image includes images of the USS Maine, images of Teddy Roosevelt, and one of General Garcia. He is a very interesting person. He, at the age of 18, joined the independence movement in Cuba. When faced with capture by the Spanish, he shot himself under the chin with his .45 caliber pistol. Although the bullet went out his forehead and knocked him unconscious, he did survive, which left him with a great scar and gave him headaches for the rest of his life. Most pictures of General Garcia, they have sort of softened his scar in his forehead. I remember when we were doing this one, Vanessa, this is a very clear picture of his forehead. And it was, when we first saw it, we had no idea what we were looking at. And when we finally got the history, but it is kind of disturbing, don't you think? His forehead, it's sort of never, I've never seen anything quite
I remember that image.
Yeah, it was, yeah, it's quite jarring.
That's one of the, yeah, that image left a, yeah, that left a lasting impression on me.
Exactly. Because I think there's actually, he does have, I think there's a hole there, and he has gauze actually in there, which whatever, we'll move on from that, but it was quite disturbing. Temperance was a really popular theme with shows locally, because they show the evils of alcohol and drunkenness. And lantern slides became a powerful propaganda tool for organizations such as the Methodist Church and the Salvation Army to illustrate the negative impact drink could have on families. Clergy, charity workers, and others who work with the poor hope that the slideshows, which often include images depicting the effects of alcohol on families and children, would encourage those in need to be more virtuous and wealthy to be more generous towards them. Ultimately, this movement succeeded. In 1920, national prohibition went into effect in the United States, and it lasted for 13 years. If you want to know more about the temperance movement and prohibition, check out two presentations that I did on temperance and prohibition in Freeport. And these presentations, like this presentation, will be made available at the Freeport Memorial's Library's YouTube page. And it will also be made available on Port Washington's page. Song slides were used both in vaudeville and minstrel shows and encouraged audience participation. Think of it as an early version of karaoke. I am not surprised that we have song slides, because Freeport was an actors' colony in the 1920s, and a lot of people associated with the theater summered in Freeport. Religious slides include biblical stories, sermons, and moral narratives. Some religious organizations use lantern slides as part of their missionary activities. I suspect ours were used in local church Sunday schools.
So this is an image of one of our lantern slides, and it doesn't necessarily fit the theme of religion, but I think it's an interesting slide, and we have several variations of this image, so I figured why not include it here. And this is an image of the First Free Church and School in Port Washington, located at the intersection of Mill Pond Road and Pleasant Avenue, with the First School and the Free Church. The land had been donated for the church by the Cox family. Their extensive land holdings in what would later become Port North were adjacent. The church was built in 1859 and served a variety of sects, as well as a mix of people, until each religious group built their own church. The structure was demolished in 1920. And I just want to read an excerpt from one of our local newspaper articles, which was written by Ernie Simon. The little building on the left was Port Washington's second public schoolhouse. Built in 1848, it stood at the head of the Mill Pond at the corner of what is now known as Pleasant Avenue and Mill Pond Road, and was known as the Little Red Schoolhouse. It only had one story and was about 25 square feet. In 1859, the school building was moved to the southerly end of the corner so that the Free Church could be built on the site shown at the right of the photo. The little schoolhouse was a landmark at that corner for many years. And like I said, we have several variations of this image where you can actually see the church close up. You can see the facade also, which is interesting. But it's going back to our collection in itself, that major structures in Port Washington were documented through lantern slides, as well as major community events. Next slide. So this is the United Methodist Church. This is also one of my favorite slides because I just love the image. It has such a nostalgic feel. And there's a dog also in the foreground here. So, and snow and sledding and, just a beautiful church as well. So this church was located at the juncture of Washington and Main Street. The church built a new facility and moved to Middle Neck Road. The Port Washington Public Library bought the church property for a new larger facility in the 1960s, leaving its former site when the library was previously located on Bellevue Avenue. Next slide.
Okay, this is an example of a reading that might accompany the slide. This slide is, I'm sorry, this is a script that would have accompanied these lantern slides. Most manufacturers of lantern slides, when you purchased a set of slides, they included some sort of readings. And they came in various length and formats. Some were printed as books, pamphlets, or a single sheet of paper, and were usually cheaply produced. And so today, unfortunately, it's very rare to find readings that still accompany the slide set. And those that do exist are in very, very poor condition. This particular slide is for a series known as Amongst the Lowest or the Darkest New York. And it's basically a ripoff of Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lived. And again, this is sort of a very example of sensationalized topics and imagery. And we do have a couple of slides that would have fit into this particular to this script. And it's very obvious that the photographs have been staged. They take you into an opium den, but it's very clean and well lit, and there's people there that are probably in costume. So they're staged photographs, but for people not familiar with New York City, they again would have been maybe horrified at seeing the inside of an opium den. This is an example of a reading that would accompany a particular slide. So this slide is a photograph of the Globe Dime Museum, which was located at 298 Bowery Street in Manhattan. I love the description of some of the curiosities, such as a two-headed boy, and some less respectable displays that would have been here. Again, sensationalizing some of these things that people may have never got to see themselves. Though Bausch & Lomb was still selling slide projectors until as late as 1945, lantern slides were quickly being replaced by newer film technology. In 1935, Kodak introduced the 35mm Kodachrome slide film in the United States. The Carousel slide projector replaced lantern slide projections in education and corporate presentations in the 1950s. As with all technology, film slides also became obsolete. In 2004, Kodak stopped making slide projectors, and in 2009, Kodachrome film was discontinued. Welcome PowerPoint. This presentation tool was developed in the late 1980s and has become a mainstay for business presentation and educational lectures, just like what we're doing today. However, PowerPoint does not forget its original lantern slide roots. Individual frames in PowerPoint are still called slides today. Lantern slides as an entertainment device began to wane after the development of the moving pictures, beginning around 1895. However, a new application for lantern slides began to emerge. In 1906, Melville Dewey applauded the use of educational lantern slides in school libraries and government agencies. In 1929, the Chicago Public Library had a circulating collection of 50,000 lantern slides for educational, social, and religious institutions. And lantern slides continued as an educational tool until the 1940s. And you can see here the Freeport Public Library in 1913 was able to get a set of slides for about the Panama Canal. And this show was shown at the Freeport Public Library. Okay, so I'm going to show slides that are from the Freeport Historical Society collection, and they're probably this is from the early 1940s, and this was part of a presentation that most likely was made by the Freeport Public Schools to get taxpayers to support the building of a new school in the village. So this is the Seaman Avenue School. Today, it is now the headquarters of the Freeport Public Schools administration building. It was located on Seaman Avenue and North Long Beach Avenue. And you can see here that it tells you a little bit about when the building was built, and it had 6 furnaces, and it says that, you know, that none of this had it was not fire retardant, and it was basically sort of setting the tone that we needed new buildings because some of these old buildings were not safe. Other pictures show a basement classroom like this. So they're showing the public that you have kids working in the basement, and look, oh my goodness, they're right next to the furnace. This is definitely unsafe. I like the interesting cropping of these photos. Here we have a picture of an assembly hall, and it's overcrowded, and these poor children. And here we have kids in a lunchroom now occupied in the basement of the school because there wasn't enough room in the cafeteria. And now we have the principal's office, and you can see how, again, it's cropped very tightly, so you get this sense of there not being a lot of space. There's another basement classroom, and you can see that, you know, it's clearly labeled that this room is poorly lit and ventilated. And here, the last slide is a proposal for a new school. Now, this never came to fruition. And this is probably due to the outbreak of World War II. A new school for Freeport would not be built until 1948. And that school is located across the street from the old Seaman Avenue School, which is today known as the Carolyn G. Atkinson School.
And then, Regina, it's interesting that those slides have the information printed, whereas all of our slides have everything sort of scribbled on handwriting, either in pencil or in ink. And, you know, from my end of it, you know, gathering that information, it's important, it's helpful, but also for us, it could be frustrating because so much of that writing has been smeared or faded over time. So I think it's actually helpful on that end to have the information printed like that.
I agree, and I suspect, and again, this is just my what I suspect is that those slides were produced so that people could go around and give lectures, but yet they were keeping to the same script. So if the superintendent of schools couldn't give that presentation, a teacher or someone else could give it to a civic institution, and they were getting the same message across. So
Right.
I suspect that's why that was done.
Hmm.
So tell us about this collection, Vanessa.
So as I mentioned earlier, our collection of lantern slides, they don't necessarily fit into those traditional themes of why lantern slides were being produced, but nonetheless, they are beautiful images. And actually, when you scan them, it's surprising how crisp and clear the image comes out. And actually, on a side note, Regina had mentioned that this is part of a series. And looking at some other lantern slides, pulling for upcoming lectures, we were able to note some information off of other lantern slides that helped us improve our metadata for some other subjects, because the images were so clear, and we could kind of hone in and look at that additional detailing. But for this selection, we're going to look at the collection of lantern slides by John J. Whitmer and Henry K. Landis. So what we decided to do was we combined both of these kind of separate collections. They predominantly are lantern slides with, we noticed we had some glass plate negatives as well kind of in there. So we just decided to combine the whole collection. For now, it might change, we might separate them again, but for now, these are some images from the Whitmer Landis lantern slide collection. So John J. Whitmer Sr. was a Port Washington resident. He he had an avid interest in photography, as well as an active civic life. Between the years of 1900 and 1911, he took hundreds of glass plate and lantern slide images that captured the transition from rural farm community to a growing suburb of a rapidly expanding New York City. People and places evocative of Port Washington were the subject of his images. So family and friends, children, farmers, rural life, the bay's commerce, recreational boating, baymen, streetscapes. In addition to his photographic pursuits, he was also a trustee at the Port Washington Public Library. At that time, it was a growing institution, and he was president from 1921 to 1922. His family resided at 23 Bayview Avenue, and parts of the collection, as well as his photographic equipment, were retrieved from the residence and donated to the public library. But the bulk of his photographs, I believe, were donated to the Cowneck Peninsula Historical Society by his son, who the Historical Society also has a collection of lantern slides. And then Henry Landis, he was a descendant of Swiss Mennonites who migrated to Lancaster County in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. While studying engineering at Lehigh University, he joined the photography club, and that started his fascination with photography. During his long life, Henry pursued an interest in a variety of subjects, as well as the technical aspects of the photographic process. Career decisions in photography were to be a continuous part of Henry's life. When in 1894, he took a job as a writer and editor for the technical magazine in New York City. His photographic subjects included those of a growing city, its changing urban population, Coney Island, the crowded streets of Manhattan. Living in New York City provided access to Long Island's North Shore. Henry initially summered in Port Washington, enjoying a sailboat, houseboat, and ice yachting. He would settle in port for a number of years, and his photographic subjects reflected his proximity to the beach and Manhasset Bay, rural farms, the arrival of the Long Island Railroad, and the changes it brought to the community. In addition to his photography, he wrote and edited for a local publication in Port Washington called Plain Talk, which documented the infrastructure, social, and political interests of Port in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1924, Landis retired to Landis Valley in Pennsylvania, where he continued to pursue his photography, transitioning from glass plates to film. And I believe there's also a museum dedicated to his photographic work. Next slide. So we have quite a few of these slides in our collection. I believe we also have glass plate negatives documenting the construction of the Main Street School, built in 1908, overlooking Manhasset Bay Harbor and the Main Street business section of town. The formal dedication of the building, which you see on the right-hand side, was held on September 17th, 1909, and it was celebrated with a huge parade and ceremony. All the district school children, local organizations, 3 marching bands paraded through town along the waterfront and up onto the school grounds. Main Street served as the town's principal 12-year school for nearly 20 years until 1927, when what is now Weber Junior Elementary School in the late 1950s, when Schreiber High School opened and the junior high students moved to Weber. And I believe it was declared a landmark by North Hempstead Town Landmarks Commission in the 1980s. Next slide. So this is also kind of a set where we have variations. And this was the train station in Port Washington. As it looked, well, you have the image on the upper right. So that's, I think that is dated March 15th, 1903. And that's the station as it looked to those leaving the train. And then the image on the lower left is not a lantern slide, but it was just another variation that I wanted to just show just for reference. So we have a mix of lantern slides of the train station as well as glass plate negatives. And this was a really nice quote I pulled from an article that Chris Bain, who is the president of the Historical Society, wrote. And it basically documents the expansion of the Long Island Railroad when it came to Port Washington. The population of our village had reached 1,200, and most of the town turned out that day to welcome the first Long Island Railroad locomotive as it steamed into town, and that was dated June 23rd, 1898. Next slide. So the image on the left, this is actually a discrepancy that I found yesterday, and Regina and I had briefly discussed this before we recorded this presentation. This is, well, what we had originally thought and what's in our metadata as one of the ceremonies I had mentioned for the opening of the Main Street School, which was documented as townsfolk and the school district's children kind of marching through town and up along Main Street onto the school grounds. That's how we had documented this image for years. And I was actually reading an article in Long Island Forum from the 80s, and they have this exact image, not crediting it to a ceremony for the opening of the dedication of the Main Street School, but actually a major ceremony and festivities that was held for the trolley line that was built in Port Washington. And the construction for this trolley line began in 1907. And then when the trolley line was built, festivities were held at the Cove Inn on the corner of Shore Road and Main Street in Port Washington. And that was dated as February 1st, 1908. And the image on the upper right, again, not a lantern slide. So it's shown here without the black mask to distinguish it as such. But I just wanted to show you just for reference. The trolley here is seen from Shore Road and Lower Main Street. As the car climbs up Main Street, it passes Shore Road, and the Cove Inn is on the left. And this image, from what Long Island Forum is listing it as, are people are marching over, and you can actually see it in the image. They're marching over the new trolley tracks on Main Street's dirt road. And then also you can note the overhead electric trolley wires. So I mean, it's interesting because, you know, this is one of the things in archives. You're really, you know, as good as the information that you gathered. So when things like this come up, I mean, I would say, and I'm sure, Regina, you would agree with me, further vetting is probably, you know, needed. But it was very interesting. You know, had I not stumbled across that article, you know, would we have known? And we've actually used this image in other projects.
Right. Well, I just want to say that I'm just looking at this. We had discussed it before we did this presentation, and this is the first time I'm seeing those two images. Now, you said the first trolley came in February, right? I think you just said that.
The festivities. And so after the line, they had, yeah.
Okay. Well, if you look at the picture on the left, there are leaves on the trees. So that doesn't look like February. So I think your metadata is probably correct, and maybe that Long Island Forum article is wrong, because those people don't look like they're dressed for winter either. So again, this happens all the time. Photographs get mislabeled and they get used, and we've had the same thing at Freeport. And so sometimes you have to just sort of, compare, like, okay, what are people wearing? When did this take place? And what's going on with the trees? But yeah, that's the great thing about
also I'm also noticing right now in the lower left, it looks like one of the women has a little parasol overhead also to shed shield her from the strong sun. So I'm, going to take a shot in the dark. I don't know, in February how strong that sun is.
Right, exactly. And
yeah, so it's interesting.
Right, and these kids look like they're dressed for spring or summer. They don't look like they're yeah. So all right, somebody made a mistake, but yeah, it does often calls into questions, and we just say, to the public, if you see some sort of discrepancy or something, let us know, because we can always go back and do a little more research and to sort of confirm that. And I mentioned,
but going back to like what's the authority? You know what I mean? Like you think you are reading something that is an authoritative resource. But you know what, you're right. People make mistakes, images get confused
all the time. And I like to, and I mentioned to Vanessa earlier, I said, when we have a couple ones that were obviously mislabeled, but when we do the metadata now, which is basically the cataloging for the image, we always like to include that sort of error, so that we are telling people we're aware that this had been used, but upon more information, we're able to sort of say that we conclude that this other information is probably correct. And we're lucky today, Vanessa, because we do have access to digital stuff. Back in the day, people didn't. So I don't think there was anything, people meant any harm. They just made mistakes. All right. So do you want me to go to the next slide?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay, so this is where you're going to find Freeport's lantern slide collection. We have a little over 40, almost 50 slides. I had mentioned we have about 600 of them. We're not going to put all 600 of them up. And the reason for that is probably about 70% of our collection is religious slides. Mostly they were probably used in the local Sunday schools. So they really don't fit our mission for New York Heritage, in sort of celebrating the history of Long Island and New York. So we're only putting the ones up that are really have some history about our community and to the state. And so right now we have a lovely collection of New York City images. And so if you go to newyorkheritage.org, you can see all our different collections, including this brand new collection of lantern slides. And I think at some point, you, Vanessa, will be probably putting some of yours up online.
That's the plan. What we're gonna, and just like you, we're not gonna put every single one of those lantern slides up. I might even combine them and put a selection of lantern slides and a selection of glass plate negatives up there, just for fun, as a way to just combine these two interesting collections. The issue with our glass plate collection is that unlike lantern slides, there are no identification at all on them. So that's going to be difficult to supply metadata for those. And then you also kind of went into storage issues. So yeah, they desperately need to be rehoused. But yes, we are working on getting some lantern slides up there. And then I wanted to ask you, when you scan and put them up on New York Heritage, are you also including a portion of the mask around the image?
I am not. I know that The U.S. Natural History Museum has put theirs up, including the mask with the identifying information on it. We chose not to, just because so many of our slides did not have any identifying information. And secondly, because we wanted them to be viewed the way the public would have viewed them in a lantern slide show. So you would have this is exactly in this picture right here. This is exactly how it would have been viewed, obviously in much larger form, but you wouldn't have had all that information. That was something that the projectionist would have read to you or told you. So that's how we're doing it. However, any identifying information that does appear on the mask, we are including that in the metadata so that so you can go back. So all that information is included. So if we know the manufacturer, we know what this image was of or what was on the slide, and what number sequence it would have been in. And one of the interesting things I'm finding is just like in PowerPoint, if you've ever done a lot of PowerPoints, you've kind of borrowed slides from previous PowerPoints. We're noticing that a lot of the slides have different number sequences on them. So basically people probably at some time created their own lantern slide shows by removing slides from different collections and creating their own sequence, almost like sort of re-editing their images to tell a different story. So we have some of our slides have multiple numbers on them. So
ours as well, I think.
Yeah.
So it's really a matter of preference, right?
Correct.
Every organization has a different preference. We're not talking about like a standardization for,
Right. I just think that, the collections that we're putting up are so limited.
Putting these up.
Yeah, they're so limited. So if somebody really wanted to see the actual slide, I don't have a problem, just pulling out the original so they can look at it. But for a practical purpose, there's so many of them. And as you know, we have a lot of limited time because we have so many different collections to work on. It was just easier to make it standard across all of them, include all the additional information in the metadata. And again, if somebody wanted to see them and see how the original looked, we can always give it to them. My other problem is that some of our descriptions are not actually on the flat part of the slide. They are on the tape, on the top part of the slides. So really where you would grab the slides, the little tiny printing across where the two images come together. And there's no way we could scan that. It would just be this little sliver that we'd have to scan. And unfortunately, a lot of those have worn off over the years, so I'm only getting partial descriptions. So actually, I have to say, I have worked very closely with the New York Historical Society because we have so many pictures of old New York and a lot of skyscrapers that I had a hard time identifying, and they have been so gracious in giving me additional information. So we're able to actually improve the metadata and give people more information. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so that is our presentation. So you can find, here's our contact information. And here is a direct links to our digital collections. So yeah, feel free to come. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at our different libraries, and please stay tuned because we're gonna be doing this program again and again. We're gonna do the port to port and North Shore, South Shore perspective. And do you have anything to say, Vanessa, in conclusion?
Just if any port residents are viewing this presentation and you want to talk about that parade slide and you have information, please contact me and we'll talk.
We'll talk. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.